Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. Today, we're talking about the Patriot Act. Such a horrible name that they give these bills. Of course, it's all propaganda. And if we're talking about the Patriot Act, you can expect that it's going to be bad news. I'm sorry to say. The Patriot Act was actually set to expire in December. It still is, but they're sneaking in the very end of a so-called must-pass spending bill to avert one of these so-called shutdowns, at least a temporary stopgap extension of the Patriot Act, probably so they can pretend to reform it, but yet really do nothing to stop the warrantless surveillance. My opinion on that. So I'm going to talk about that, what they're doing to sneak the legislation in there, the extension. I'm going to talk about the Patriot Act in general, what it is, and the part of it that they're renewing. Section 215 is very prominent, but also even more than that. And then I also want to talk about some of the important history behind the Fourth Amendment, going all the way back to James Otis and the American Revolution. But before doing all that, first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have a video version that we do live through Periscope, DLive, Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube. We have archived video versions at Brighteon.com, BitChute, and BitTubers.com, plus a audio-only podcast edition over on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, and elsewhere. For everyone who's been leaving comments, feedback, sending emails, reviews on iTunes, all of that really helps spread the word. Well, the emails don't help spread the word, but it helps me understand what you're interested in hearing about or if you have questions. So I appreciate all of that so very much. And I'm very grateful for you spending a little bit of your time with me today. Let's look over into the live chat and see what's going on. I want to say hi to everyone joining me. Essential Freedom, Tyler B., good to see you, Tyler. EHP Training, Richard Kramer, Frank I, Ward Lawrence, Alan Drone, and everyone else over on YouTube. Florida Tenther, Clay Davis. On Facebook, Jay Armstrong. I appreciate you guys spending some time with me today. And whether you're watching live or in the archives, I mentioned briefly just a minute ago that all of the actions that you may take on these programs, whether it's a review or a thumbs up or whatever, comments and the like, all of those actions trigger the algorithm of the platform that you're watching on, and it tells that platform, especially the mainstream ones, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, the Twitters, and the like, it tells the platform to show the program to more people. So I really appreciate you guys doing all that. I'm being told someone's not getting sound. Daniel on Facebook is saying no sound. Maybe if anybody else is having problems, it doesn't look like I'm having issues here. Okay, Dan Reed. So maybe you have to if you've got an autoplay or something on Facebook, you might have to uncheck or click it to actually get the sound. I apologize if that was something on my end. Anyways, let's get right to this. First of all, on Tuesday, and this is a report from the CIA organ, the Washington Post, House passes short-term spending bill to avert Friday shutdown. And they put it this way. This actually came out yesterday, talking about passage of a bill on Tuesday. The House passed a short-term spending bill that would avert a government shutdown Friday. Now, mind you, when you have a government that is the largest in the history of the world with tens of trillions of dollars in debt. Now, the national debt of $23 trillion and growing isn't the entirety of that debt. So the best thing that could happen would be for that government to stop doing stuff. That's my view. So the idea that they're always pushing here is that these things have to keep happening. They have to keep getting passed, these stopgap funding measures, these budget bills, whatever you want to call them, however they refer to them in the mainstream media. They give us this message that it's dangerous to have a shutdown. Not that, okay, government is going to get the heck out of your lives, it's going to stop violating your rights, but they're averting a problem. So, but what they're also adding in this report at Washington Post, and almost every other one that I saw, especially in the mainstream, but in other areas, was that this was just going to be a stopgap. And eventually they're going to have another debate over building a border wall and things like that. So we're being distracted in these funding debates. And I'll show you how in just a moment. They go on. The legislation which passed 231 to 192 extends government funding through December 20th. It must pass the Senate and be signed by Trump before midnight Thursday. If not, government funding would expire, causing many agencies to begin to shutter operations and furlough staff. Most of those agencies shouldn't exist at all in the first place. Here from CNBC, again, another report, similar approach. But they point out that Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, said Monday that the White House indicated President Donald Trump would support a plan to keep the government running through December 20th. The president's backing suggests the GOP-held Senate will pass the measure. I have no doubt that it's going to pass and get signed, and there's going to be more excuse-making again and again and again. We keep hearing things like never again. I know in 2017 we were told never again would a spending bill be signed like this again, but yet another one gets signed and another one gets signed, and then it's like, well, we got to make sure that there isn't a shutdown. And as Michael White is pointing out on Facebook in the comments, he says, I love how government plays word games. And he's talking probably about the name of the Patriot Act, but they're also using a word game when they're talking about shutdown. Because the mass surveillance isn't going to shut down if government shuts down, and I'm putting shut down in quotes. The mass surveillance isn't going to stop when we're talking about Patriot Act. The gun control isn't going to stop. The Federal Reserve isn't going to stop printing and devaluing the currency. The empire isn't going to stop funding and participating in the war against Yemen, killing people by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. I don't even know what the astronomical numbers are there, starving people to death. They're not going to stop those things. But maybe you won't be able to access a park or something like that. Although I think parks are pretty easy to take care of in comparison to some of these other things. But this is all word games because they're averting a shutdown. But it's a shutdown that isn't really a shutdown. It's a scare tactic. So then I noticed in a couple of blogs, and this tweet was posted by Evan Greer. And Evan is, I believe she is the deputy director of Fight for the Future, which is a great organization when it comes to surveillance issues. I have communicated with them a number of times. They do awesome work when it comes to facial recognition, things like the Amazon Ring, which I did a program on here a couple of months ago. These surveillance tools, mass warrantless surveillance under the Patriot Act and the like, and they've been doing this no matter who's in Washington, D.C. They were vehemently opposed to mass surveillance when Barack Obama was there, and they're primarily on the progressive end of the spectrum. At least that's my impression. And I know after Evan posted this tweet, she got a lot of negative feedback talking about how, oh, now that Trump's in there, you're going to go after the surveillance. Where were you when Obama was in there? And it's funny how this is something that we hear from conservatives all the time. Where were you when Obama? Or like we'll hear the same type of thing. Where were you when so-and-so was in office? But they get the same kind of thing on the left. Well, here's what Evan wrote. Wow, House Democrats are ignoring civil liberties and including a 3-month straight reauthorization of the Patriot Act with zero reform in the continuing resolution. Very cool way to resist Trump by ensuring he continues to have terrifying authoritarian surveillance powers. And this is a really good call out that she's doing here because there's so much talk about the Democrats being the resistance. And I'm all on board with resisting whatever administration is in charge, as long as government continues violating the Constitution, which it does every second of every day of our lives in one way or another, by participating, enacting, enforcing, and funding mass unconstitutional programs. And here we're talking about the Patriot Act. Its very existence is a violation of the Constitution. As long as that continues, I'm all on board with resistance. But this is absurd to claim that the Democrats in Washington, D.C. are resistance. It's also absurd to claim that Republicans in any way are resistance because they're really just not opposing. You'll hear some rhetoric opposing one program or another, but on the main issues of surveillance, war, crazy funding, Federal Reserve, things like that, they're all kind of hand in hand when you really get down to it. And Evan really nails it. How can you claim to be the resistance when you're going to continue giving the guy that you claim to have the worst powers on earth the most power, the most dangerous person on the face of the earth possibly? That's how I talked about it at my recent speech at the Mises Supporters Summit here in Los Angeles at the end of last month. You know, you can't really think of these people as any type of resistance. And I'm glad to see Evan pointing this out. And she noted that this was included at the very end of the legislation. We can see this in a report from Common Dreams, also another progressive publication, but nailing it on this particular issue. The provision which appears on the second to last page of the funding measure, and these aren't short pieces of legislation, even the short ones are long in Washington, D.C. It appears on the second to last page. It literally is 5 lines. That's it. They didn't have to put it in there, but they intentionally put it in there. Pelosi and gang absolutely intentionally put it in there. They didn't have to, and it appears on the second to last page of the funding measure, quickly drew outrage from advocacy groups and vows of opposition from a few House members. And this was on Monday. AOC tweeted, yeah, that's going to be a no from me. Ilhan Omar said, yeah, no, count me out. I know Justin Amash has been hammering on this. And so for those of you who, like me, recognize that people like AOC have horrible views on government power in general, can say, you know what? If she's going to vote no, and I'm curious to see where she voted on this, if she's going to vote no on the entire emergency funding piece of legislation, this must pass because of an opposition to extending the Patriot Act, then yes, we can absolutely applaud her and Omar and Amash and whoever else voted no on that for that particular reason. Now, we can also applaud the other 192 who voted no on it as well. It doesn't matter what their reason, because the fact of the matter is any funding bill for Washington, D.C. is funding all kinds of unconstitutional programs. But back to the Patriot Act. Here's a quick overview from Electronic Frontier Foundation, which I think is probably the best organization out there consistent on surveillance issues. And they just have kind of an explainer page with links to all kinds of different blogs and articles about Patriot Act. And here, just a quick overview to remind us what's going on. The USA Patriot Act, which is officially the uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act. Now, Patriot isn't talking about patriotism, but they use that word creatively, just like who was it that mentioned it above? I think it was Michael White mentioned it earlier on Facebook, talking about how they're using these word games. It is a propaganda tool, but they come up with these acronyms. USA Patriot Act is really tools to intercept and obstruct terrorism act. And you hear obstruct and intercept, you know that they're going to be conducting surveillance that isn't even close to the Fourth Amendment. And it was developed as anti-terrorism legislation in response to the September 11th, 2001 attacks. From my understanding, at least what I remember at the time, it was already ready to go before those attacks happened. I think they just literally had them sitting there waiting for the right, I guess, crisis. Don't let it go to the waste, right? And EFF goes on. Patriot gives sweeping search and surveillance to domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence agencies and eliminates checks and balances that previously gave courts the opportunity to ensure that those powers were not abused. I would just argue that the courts have not actually acted as a check and balance, and those previous checks and balances were not proper in the first place. The check and balance is the Fourth Amendment. That's the rule, and the check and the balance is the people of the several states to check the power every single time they go beyond the Constitution. And I do want to have a little bit of reminder here before talking about what's being renewed. This reminder from James Madison. Again, we know that the Patriot Act was developed as an anti-terrorism tool in response to September 11th, 2001 attacks. But James Madison warned us, not just James Madison, but he most prominently, or at least in my kind of language, James Madison is one that I cite so often on this, and you'll hear me mention this quote. If you're new to the show, you'll hear me mention this quote over and over and over again. I've got it up on the screen for those who are watching on video. Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. So you don't have to take conspiracy theorist view of the September 11th attacks to be recognizing that government is going to use that situation to take your liberty. Period. It is a universal truth. That's James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, telling us that this is what government does. When they have a situation that's dangerous or that incites fear, and John Adams in 1776 told us that fear is the foundation of most government. So when people are afraid, they're afraid of terrorists. then they're going to turn a blind eye to government, using that to increase their power and it create a loss of liberty. And when that isn't there, then government is still going to ratchet up the fear mongering anyways. And that's James Madison saying it. Going forward, this is a blog post from EFF again, talking about passage of this piece of legislation in the House, which is now in the Senate. It's probably going to be debated either today or tomorrow, so Thursday or Friday, and I do expect the president to sign it. And they go like this, or they put it this way: tucked into the end of this must-pass legislation, and they call it that. I don't know if EFF is claiming that they have to pass this, but everybody calls it that. And maybe that's just to recognize that this is how the people in Congress are going to treat it. They're going to pass something. In a section titled Other Matters, is language reauthorizing 3 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act authorities currently set to expire on December 15th, 2019. The new expiration date would be March 15th, 2020. Like, they could just let it roll. But no, they have to expressly say, well, what's running out of time? That means with all the laws and regulations on the books, someone is literally going out of their way to make sure that the Patriot Act or this FISA authorities are extended so they have more time to tinker with it. And I really think the scam is in when they claim that they're going to do a reform like the so-called USA Freedom Act from a couple of years ago. They want to do these so they can still look good during an election year, but then the reforms really do nothing, or they create different problems for the Constitution and liberty down the line. So going forward, EFF puts it this way. One of the expiring authorities in question is Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act. Section 215 has become synonymous with the NSA's database of billions of telephone records, known as the Call Detail Records, the CDR program. But it actually has an even wider scope. They go on. In addition to authorizing ongoing collection of telephone records, Section 215's Business Records Authority allows the government to obtain a secret order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court requiring third parties to hand over any other records or other tangible thing, in quotes, if deemed relevant, in quotes, to an international terrorism, counter-espionage, or foreign intelligence investigation. So basically access to just about everything. And of course, they want that renewed. The administration called for a renewal of this in the last couple of months. We know mainstream Democrats and Republicans are fully on board. There's very little opposition to it in Washington, D.C., to this specifically. And in another blog post, and I will link all of these in show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty about a half hour to an hour after the show is over, so that way you can read it in full and do a little bit more research if you find this interesting. But EFF goes on in this other post. In 2015, a federal appeals court held that NSA's interpretation of Section 215 to conduct this surveillance dragnet was unprecedented and unwarranted. So then they passed the USA Freedom Act, which I mentioned, and it had some limited authority to conduct this Call Detail Records program, the CDR program, and they still were collecting, even though we were told the USA Freedom Act was going to reform the Patriot Act and things were going to be better. And this is just another, I'm sure that acronym is awful as well, but they still were collecting millions and millions of records. And then last year in 2018, NSA was actually compelled to delete millions of records after it learned that some of the data had been collected from phone service providers without legal authority or authorization. And this is partly why. And we know that the NSA has told us they're not using this program actively right now. I think they're just running into logistic issues with it, but they want to get it reauthorized. I'm sure the Pelosi's and the McConnells of the world want to just kind of tinker with it and make a new version of it, so the NSA doesn't run into any kind of legal issues where it's more difficult for them. I'm sure something bad is happening. So, again, not awesome news, But I do want to remind everybody what the Fourth Amendment says. And this is from a great article that Mike Meharry wrote, it looks like just about 5 years ago. Fourth Amendment, the history behind unreasonable. And I'll just read the Fourth Amendment because it's just an important reminder. So few people actually even read the Bill of Rights or the entire body of the Constitution that let's just get to it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And Mike put it this way. He basically said the founders and the founding generation, they understood what made an unreasonable search. And an unreasonable search was one that didn't follow those rules. So they're first making a statement in the Fourth Amendment that the right of the people to be secure from searches, from unreasonable searches, shall not can kind of not be violated, or has kind of a malleable limitation on violation, just shall not. And what defines an unreasonable search? One, that where a warrant to do that search is not based upon the restrictions in the Fourth Amendment. Probable cause supported by oath or affirmation and describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Dragnet surveillance, mass warrantless surveillance is an unreasonable search, period. And this article from Dave Benner talks about, this is one that we published that same year, talking about the writs of assistance, comparing it to NSA surveillance of today. And he's going all the way back to the 1760s, where we're talking about James Otis. He put it this way. In the 1760s, the situation was dire. In order to enforce its coercive means of taxation, the British Parliament enacted the writs of assistance. And a lot of people don't realize that these writs, these kind of mass warrantless surveillance programs from the British Empire were really done to enforce taxes. For all we know, they have the same surveillance powers today. We may learn in 100 years that the surveillance programs are really being used as a tool to help the IRS. I wouldn't be surprised. And maybe someone out there in the chat has reference links that actually point me in the right direction on that. If you do, please let me know, or feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And these writs of assistance, Dave writes, were court orders that provided legal sanction for any official of the British government to enter and search the homes of colonists. Commissioners, members of the military, and custom officials could all utilize the writs against the will of property owners. Of course, they just were making sure that people were being compliant with British acts of taxation. And Dave reminds us that this was primarily done in order to ensure their compliance with controversial means of taxation such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. Consequently, the British authorities urged that these measures were necessary in order to provide stability for the government and security for its citizens. And just go back to James Madison again. It is a universal truth that the loss of liberty is to charge against provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. And even though, again, it's for your security, they weren't talking about a danger against a foreign invader, but still the measures, the taxes needed to be collected. And if the taxes couldn't be collected according to the British government, and all governments really, then it's a dangerous situation. So we have to do surveillance to make sure that all the taxes are collected in order to keep everyone safe. And that is the argument we always get. For your safety usually means so we can control you. Dave goes on. In one case in 1761, James Otis Jr., who a lot of people call the godfather of the Fourth Amendment, he argued for hours against the legitimacy of the writs at the Old State House in Boston. And while 5 judges in his case decided to uphold the constitutionality of the writs, and Otis lost the case in question, he made a potent impression on compatriots that would come after him. And this is how John Adams put it. He was so moved by the persuasive power of Otis's words, he wrote it this way: American independence was then and there born. People were really moved by what James Otis was saying against the crown, really. He put it again this way: Mr. Otis's oration against writs of assistance breathed into this nation the breath of life. I do encourage you to read this in more detail. Dave talks about a specific piece of legislation that was introduced that year in 2014 and ties it all together. And I think we can take that same approach again here in 2019 and 2020. I also want to point out, and this is from Suzanne Sherman. I'm covering all my favorite bloggers here at TAC, Meharry, Benner, Suzanne Sherman. She pointed out that Judge Kavanaugh, the so-called constitutionalist, is totally in favor of this type of mass surveillance under the Patriot Act. He put it this way, or she actually wrote in the article, with regard to bulk collection of metadata by the NSA, Judge Kavanaugh declared it entirely consistent with the Fourth Amendment. And here's how Kavanaugh put it. The government's collection of telephony metadata from a third party, such as a telecommunications service provider, is not considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. That's Kavanaugh. Bulk collection of metadata. And we can do a whole show on metadata and how they can actually track and trace you through metadata. But this is a mass data collection program. He specifically says, quote, it is not considered a search under the Fourth Amendment, at least under the Supreme Court's decision in Smith versus Maryland in 1979. That precedent remains binding on lower courts in our hierarchical system of absolute vertical stare decisis. And if you watched my short video that I did on this a week or so ago, stare decisis, precedent versus the Constitution, this is the legal doctrine of holding to precedent, whether it's right or wrong. They don't always do it, but as a general rule, they hold the precedent, and they will hold the precedent even when they know it's incorrect. Now, Kavanaugh doesn't say anything about that precedent. He's literally just saying, look, this is not a search, so this is how it is. And we've never heard him actually say anything negative about this mass warrantless surveillance. Richard Banks makes a good point in the live chat. See also Chris Ann Hall about James Otis Jr. Okay, if you have actually a specific video or article that she did on James Otis, I would love to see that. Go ahead and post a link over on Facebook, and I'll check it out a little bit later. Oh, Richard Kramer points out that James Otis did not do that speech at the State House in Boston. And that's actually a good point. We need to make an edit on that. It was at the Barnstable County Courthouse, and the statue still stands out in front of that county courthouse today. Eric Nance on Facebook. Furthermore, bills funding multi-power execution is arguably unconstitutional, as it isn't necessary or proper to make the funding of one delegated power dependent on another. That's an interesting point. And also over in the live chat, Richard Kramer again, the Patriot Act is not about spying on terrorists. It's about spying on patriots and patriotic Americans. It's actually, I agree, it's about spying on everybody. And a lot of people think that just because they're collecting all this data, they're spying on so many people that it becomes pointless. Oh, you don't have anything to worry about because they're spying on so much that they can't do anything. But we already know, and I did an episode a couple of months ago called NSA Spying is as Bad as You Thought, because they're now taking that information where they're building profiles, and the FBI has been using it in millions of situations. Unconstitutional warrantless surveillance, and as the algorithms get better and better, they're better able to target people through this type of stuff. Tyler B. points out that the war on drugs and the Patriot Act go hand in hand. So does American foreign policy as well. Absolutely. All of this stuff really, really ties in. And taking a look a little bit more here. The propaganda of the authoritarian state, essential freedom. Gregory Maher points out one of these types of propaganda names for legislation. The Affordable Care Act is another one as well. He hate me, says I swore an oath to precedent. Yeah, that's what they all say. Like, they're not swearing an oath to the Constitution to uphold the Constitution. They're swearing an oath to precedent. If the Supreme Court, the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means until it changes his mind. I got that phrase from Kevin Gutzman, the great author and historian, a little while ago as well. And Dan Reed, I agree with this one. If you've got nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, citizen. I mean, not that I agree with that mentality, but that is the one that we hear all the time. And people who are basically, I don't know, I guess we can call them bootlickers. They're happy to throw that out there. Whenever we talk about opposing mass surveillance, they're either afraid of terrorists, they love government power. or they don't want to be moved to take any action. They're just too weak to be part of it. But there's some great quotes in response to that I don't have off the top of my head. Essential Freedom says, I say the people need to organize in large numbers to openly defy federal laws. Absolutely. And we've certainly worked to do this on a state and local level as well, because just defying federal laws on surveillance becomes difficult. You certainly want to do what EFF calls surveillance self-defense. I don't have that link handy right now, but maybe I can pull it up. Hold on here. Surveillance self-defense. Yeah, EFF has this whole page, tips, tools, and how-tos for safer online communications. They're not going to guarantee total, complete privacy, but this is a great starting point for the individual to help protect their privacy against government invasion. And that's really what it is, invading our rights. But then on top of it, we also have to end warrantless surveillance at a state and local level, and the use of warrantless surveillance that's passed along to them from the federal level, and then turn off resources for the support of NSA surveillance, FBI surveillance, DHS, all of it. And that in and of itself is an entire episode talking about the strategy on how to deal with it. Anyways, I appreciate everyone in the live chat. I really enjoy the back and forth and the feedback. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. Again, not positive news, but it's stuff that it's important for all of us to be aware of, I believe. If you support the show, make sure to smash the like, subscribe, get bell notifications on YouTube's. Man, I am just rambling today. On the YouTubes, get bell notifications and subscribe. And on iTunes, if you leave a review, that helps us a ton. We've got a good number of them coming in. I'm very grateful for all of them. And if you want to kick in financially, for as little as $2 a month, you can help us make a difference. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you for spending time with me today. I hope you have a great hump day, and I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.